I decided to do my case study on a particular learner who piqued my interest, as his motivation seemed so high. It made me curious to see how he fit into the motivational theories we've learned about in this class. I titled my case study The Tinge of Acculturation, which lurks in the background, because I have a very difficult time trying to distinguish between acculturation and motivation. I found that the more that I looked into the underlying principles which I saw to be driving the case study, I was left with more questions than answers. It's a very difficult thing to quantify to the degree motivation is playing a factor rather than the natural ability or possibly just really good teachers. So I decided it would be best if I attempted to separate these questions and attempt to answer them individually. As it's so difficult to quantify motivation, I think a more effective way to accomplish this is to attempt to display what degree motivation plays a role in second language acquisition. Top of explaining the more cognitive approaches to motivation were developed to emphasize the importance of a student's interpretation of certain events that are the role of their beliefs, emotions and values, and achievements and situations. This leads to expectancy value theories, which treat behavior as an extension of one's expectancies. This leads me to believe that expectancy value theory seems to be explaining what drives the motivation, which may push students past their peers. While there are individuals like Graham who believe there is a push and pull relationship between motivation and two aspects called integrative and assimilative motivation, which may explain how acculturation affects motivation, there's a particular desire presented that pushes people towards that critical language learning. This may also relate to the nature-nurture scale of human development for self-worth, and it may be related to acculturation, which leads to motivation. The participant profile, our student, age 15, arrived from Havana, Cuba. When he first arrived in the United States, he did not speak English in the slightest. Part of the process was being given the ACCESS exam, which provides a determination of a student's English ability based on WITA standards. And by the WITA standards, our learner was found to be level 1. The profile of WITA level 1 is listening. The student may understand oral messages that include visuals and gestures and may contain few everyday words or phrases in English. Speaking, the student may be able to communicate orally in English using gestures and language that may contain a few words. Reading, the student may understand written texts that include visuals and may contain a few words or phrases in English. And writing, the student may be able to communicate in writing using visuals and symbols that may contain a few words in English. It's an important consideration that there is no level 0, so he may have been below these standards, but there's simply no way to tell. As a 9th grader, it is very difficult to progress at a rate which he can catch up to his peers with such a low level of knowledge. To gauge the effect of motivation on learning, we need to be able to understand what is normal and if the learner is gaining self-worth through a process of acculturation. Then, what is the normal amount of self-worth one can expect to gain? We can begin by looking at graduation rates as part of our consideration. This gives us an understanding of the role of motivation by looking at a singular learner and comparing them to the national average. This should make motivation the independent variable. Nationwide, the 4-year graduation rate of students is roughly 67%, which is comparable to some of the lower marginalized groups. However, the average learner in an American school has a graduation rate of 84%. As our learner is from Florida, I think it's important to consider that in order to reproduce the environment of the typical learner, we have to look at Florida's 4-year graduation rates for ESL students, which is slightly lower than the national average at 62%. Tracking our learner's progress is very important in order to provide a proper comparison. As mentioned before, he was placed immediately into the ESL program, but that's not where the story ends. He was enrolled in the middle of 9th grade, and by 10th grade his English was already improving. His grades began to rise and his motivation became notable at the point where he began to attend after-school programs as well as the summer program for ESL. His dedication quickly paid off by the end of the 10th grade as considerations began to test him again. With the rise of his grades to straight A's, he was retested and then reclassified out of the ESL program. Between January 2011 and fall of 2013, which is a very short amount of time in the ESL program, he was able to reclassify out. It's very remarkable, and I think this entails specific ideas of acculturation and motivation working in tandem. Clearly, his initial frustration related to his lack of ability to communicate with his peers and his desire to assimilate drove his motivation to improve his English. Typically, after 6 to 0.7 years, half of the Spanish ESL students are reclassified, but these statistics are kept artificially low by much younger students. Students who are entering the ESL program in primary school, as our student entered in secondary school, it means that the learner's motivation is so great that he defied the statistics. Because by all available metrics, he was not likely to graduate on time, nor was he likely to leave the ESL program before graduation. Nothing else can really account for the learner's success other than a high degree of motivation. So I'll leave you with this. Our learner went from WITA Level 1 to WITA Level 6, which is described as formerly limited English proficiency and now fully English proficient. This means that our learner was fully proficient, which would mean that our learner no longer requires ESL classes or assistance. The student is in effect fluent in English. The pupil reads, writes, speaks, and comprehends English within the academic classroom setting. To be able to make such an abrupt jump like that cannot be explained by anything other than a high degree of motivation. Sources are cited.